Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. And welcome to today's webinar. Again, we want to extend a warm welcome to all of our participants today. And thank you for joining us for Understanding Human Trafficking for Mental Health Professionals. This is session 1, Understanding the Foundation of Human Trafficking. And our presenter today is Dr. Sophia Jones. This webinar is sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We're a SAMHSA-funded technical assistance and training center. And we enhance the capacity of behavioral health workforce to deliver evidence-based and promising practices to individuals with mental health conditions. And we provide this to a region too, as well as other regions. If you are joining us from outside of our region, we cover New York, New Jersey, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. The MHTTC provides training and technical assistance focused on evidence-based practices for people with serious mental health conditions, including illness management and recovery, supported housing, support employment, and support education. We also address comprehensive school-based mental health services and support, wellness and recovery for people with mental health conditions and for providers, and mental health and recovery among Hispanic and Latinx populations, and online self-paced education courses covering some of these topics. As a reminder, all of our training, technical assistance, and resources are available to you at no cost. We invite you to subscribe to our email listserv so you can receive notices of our upcoming training events and programs. Following this webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short evaluation survey. We use this feedback to assist us in developing our future trainings that are relevant to your professional needs. Therefore, we thank you in advance for your feedback. We also want to let you know that this webinar will be recorded. Towards the end of the presentation, the Q&A will not be recorded, but the recording of the didactic portion will be posted on our website within a week of today. At the time of this presentation, Marian Delphin Rittman served as Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Use at SAMHSA. The opinions expressed herein are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. No official support or endorsement of DHHS or SAMHSA for the opinions described in this presentation is intended or should be inferred. We encourage you to interact with our presenter during the webinar by using the chat feature. Please post any comments or questions you have in the chat, and I will collect your questions as we go and ask them of the presenter during the Q&A time towards the end of the presentation. During the webinar, our presenter may pose questions to you. Please use the chat feature to answer those questions. As a reminder, the MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. We also like to remind you of our 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline resource for people who are experiencing suicidal ideation, mental health, substance use crisis, emotional distress, or people concerned about someone else in crisis. Now let's begin our webinar. We have with us Dr. Sophia Jones. So Dr. Sophia Jones is a training and consultation specialist with the Rutgers Behavioral Health Research and Training Institute for the Children's System of Care Training and Technical Assistance Program. Dr. Jones has over 18 years of experience in the behavioral health field, specializing in culturally competent focused crisis intervention and service plans. She brings years of experience working with children and family diagnosed with mental illness from the New Jersey System of Care. Dr. Jones continues to advocate for health equity and equal access to mental health services. She specializes in healthcare professional and corporate development training programs focused on working with families living in poverty, health disparities, health and public policy, anti-racism, human trafficking, cultural competence, implicit bias, effective team building, diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, the culture of hip hop, developing rapport with children and families, and safety in the community. Dr. Jones earned a doctorate from Seton Hall University and is a strong advocate against human trafficking. At this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jones, and I will turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for that warm introduction. And I'm just looking at the chat box and I'm seeing all of these people that are coming in from different parts of the country and the world just to come in and have a discussion with us about human trafficking. For me, this is extremely warm, a warm introduction from everyone because just looking at the people who are interested in human trafficking allows me the opportunity to reflect on 10 years ago when I was first introduced to this conversation about human trafficking and how this can impact not only our children and families within New Jersey, but also throughout the world. So again, I'm excited to see everyone here. We're going to begin today to talk about and set a foundation for the next 2 trainings that are going to accompany this first workshop. In the time that we are going to share this information, I'm encouraging you to ask questions. I'm also encouraging you to reflect on your community, on your place where you are working, on a lot of places that this may be occurring. And often we have victims of trafficking that are just hidden in plain sight. Um, our objectives today are fairly simple. We do have a short period of time, but we want to talk about defining human trafficking and what that is. Throughout the training, I'm also going to give you some information in the form of questions, which are asking, what are some myths and facts, right? Because there's a lot of storytelling and there's a lot of information that's being dispersed, but what are some myths and facts? We're also going to talk about the different forms of human trafficking. Often when we come into this space, people are interested in only sex trafficking, but there's also different forms of trafficking. We're going to talk about this in the form of how this shows up, right? And often it is a sense of stealing someone's freedom, right? Their freedom to be a young person in this world, this freedom to grow up as an adult and not feel oppressed. And towards the end of the training, we're going to talk about red flags, whether you are a clinician, whether you are a social worker, or whatever role that you are playing in your organization. What are some things that you need to be mindful of? I just want to kind of cue you in to how I kind of have conversations about human trafficking. And a lot of the information that I share comes from the Children's System of Care in New Jersey. During our Q&A, we will share some of your insights in terms of where you are working. So I just want to be mindful of that. When we think about human trafficking, often there's a lot of myths and there's a lot of facts that come into play. And often people will, come up and say, is human trafficking always equated with violent crime? And for the most part, when we think about this, it is actually a myth. When we talk about human trafficking, it doesn't always have to involve a violent crime. It does not always have to involve abuse. The abuse can be in different forms. It could be physical, it could be verbal abuse. There's a process for which people are groomed into this system of human trafficking. And so when we think about this idea of it just being associated with a violent crime, that is a myth. The other question that comes into play often is, all human trafficking involves sex. And as I mentioned earlier, that is not the case. There are different forms of trafficking, which include labor trafficking and also organ trafficking. When we talk about trafficking or trafficked persons and that they are always from another country or an immigrant from other countries, this is also a myth. When we have these discussions about trafficking, often there's this confusion about human trafficking and smuggling, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes, that there is a clear difference. One of the things that's always interesting when we talk about someone and always being involved as a conversation that says, listen, it's only immigrants from other countries, is people can be trafficked right in their own town. and within the United States. I remember having trainings and talking about human trafficking years ago, and people often believed that it wouldn't happen in the United States, that it was more equated with other countries. And in particular, when we talk about different populations, if we were just focusing on historically marginalized groups, that's where people often would go with their conversations about trafficking. So that in itself is a myth. The other question that comes up too is only undocumented foreign nationals get trafficked in the United States, and that is also a myth as well. When we think about undocumented foreign nationals, this isn't always the case, but unfortunately, in some situations where people are in positions where they're very vulnerable, this can happen to them, but it doesn't just happen to that group. When we talk about human trafficking, the other piece that often comes up is whether human trafficking only happens in illegal or underground industries. There's been many cases, in particular in New Jersey, where people have been trafficked in braiding salons, in nail salons. And so often these industries in which people are trafficked, which can also include massage parlors, is in areas that are in open businesses on main streets and strip malls. And so we know that this is also not true. So what I want to do now is often there's a lot of conversation about what human trafficking is. And I think this needs to be clear, especially for all of us on the call, so that we have an idea of what human trafficking actually is. One of the things that really stands out for me because of the work that I've been doing in terms of advocating for survivors is the force, fraud, and coercion. Okay, often when we talk about human trafficking, people believe that it is only associated with sex. It is only young individuals of a specific age, whereas the average age is between 11 and 14. And so we have to be mindful about how we define what human trafficking is. The reason why I pause on the force, fraud, and coercion is to also assist when we are trying to prosecute for human trafficking. So when we talk about human trafficking, it's important to understand that human trafficking does not discriminate. When we think of human trafficking, right, often people will sit in this space and say, well, it only happens to certain individuals. It only happens to Black and Brown people in Black and Brown communities. And that is not the case at all. Unfortunately, when we talk about human trafficking, this could happen to anyone at any given time. And this is why this is such a heinous crime and needs to be addressed. So let's talk a little bit about human trafficking and how it is defined. When we think about this whole idea of recruitment and transportation, just because a person is transported to another space, just because they are harbored in a specific area, that is just a portion of that. The other piece that I want to bring to your attention is that the person that is actually involved in the transportation is also part of that force, fraud, and coercion. So you will find that someone will groom someone or recruit someone into the grooming process by saying, you know what, I have a job for you in this city or in this state, and I'm going to pay your ticket and I'm going to pay your transportation ticket to come here. And once they get here, they change the narrative. When we talk about this in that context, we see now that that is a case of recruitment, that is a case of transportation, but once they get to the state, there's force, fraud, and coercion. The other piece that people have to understand is that when we talk about human trafficking, it doesn't always have to transfer money. It could be service. It could be that the person is working in one area and they don't get any money at all, and there's a third party that is involved. That third party is getting another type of compensation from another person. So just to be clear, when we talk about exploitation for profit, it doesn't always have to involve money. It could be a service. So you could have a third party, which again, I'm mentioning third party because people often say, well, that's not trafficking if it's just between two people. But in actuality, when you bring that third party that is gaining some type of monetary or other item, then it is considered trafficking. What I also want to point out today is that when we hear and talk about human trafficking, that there's this reference automatically to just women. But we also have to be mindful that this can occur with men, it can occur with young boys, and it can also impact persons who identify as part of the LGBTQ community and or persons with an intellectual or developmental disability. Now, when we talk about different models of recruitment, I think it's important because sometimes people get caught up in this idea of how does human trafficking actually occur? And I'm giving you this model because I think that this model really speaks to how the process occurs. But I also want to be mindful that there is no playbook or specifics that happen with every person that is recruited. And it's important for you to understand that it will look different or may look different for many survivors and or victims of trafficking. The actions that may be involved is there's some recruitment, there's some harboring, there's some transportation here. They're providing some type of shelter at some point. They may maintain that there's a lies within their community, their shame that's going to be put on their family. The means is always force, fraud, and coercion. And the purpose is for sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or organ trafficking. So when we talk about this model, this really kind of gives you an idea because we talked about over the last few slides some definitions about human trafficking, but now whatever organization that you're a part of, you're starting to see how these actions go into means and then into purpose. Now, let's move a little bit beyond the threats and violence, right? Sometimes it's very difficult even to prosecute or to talk to someone who we believe is a victim of trafficking because they will say, wait a minute, this was something that some person that I love that said that they're going to care for me. And this actually is part of the grooming process to establish that you have a relationship or that you have a friendship with that individual. And this could happen in the school setting. This could happen online, which we'll talk in a couple of days about the impact of social media. This can happen as part of being a group that is in the school, for example, cheerleading groups, social groups, gymnastic groups. This can happen within any type of extracurricular activity or school setting. The other piece that needs to be discussed when we talk about moving beyond those threats and violence is that someone will say, I'm going to employ you to work in a bar, or I'm going to employ you to provide entertainment. And they pose this as a legitimate means for people to gain employment. Now, if you think about this, this especially happened during COVID-19 when people were losing their jobs. So you had a 200% increase in the amount of human trafficking because either the youth or that young person was interested in obtaining employment. You also see that this becomes and has become more common when we talk about modeling agencies. The other piece that may come into play is someone is promised an education. If you come to this country and you may be part of a lottery process, and as a result of getting you into this country, I'm going to make sure that you are afforded with a higher education. And those promises are told either to their parents or to them. I think when you hear that type of example, especially when we talk about someone being transported from another country, we have to be absent of assumptions and judgment because this is often the case where someone will say, I'm going to promise you an opportunity to get an education. They make an agreement with the family that they're going to take care of them. Unfortunately, when they bring them to this country, they change the narrative. And that's the piece that we have to be mindful of. When we talk about internet chat rooms and game rooms, especially gaming systems, you will have a lot of recruitment that comes in the form of a conversation on a gaming system, or when we have those exchanges, especially when we have young boys. And this has been the recruitment ground for not just youth, but for people to possibly come into this narrative of being a CEO or be involved in the trafficking industry. So this doesn't mean that we have to be fearful of these exchanges. We just have to be aware of them so that we can have conversations with our youth and their families about how this may appear when that person is on the gaming console. One thing again that is becoming more common is that you're having more young boys to be recruited using the gaming systems. Now, I want you to sit back for a minute and think about some of the things that we've been discussing over the past couple of minutes, right? We've talked about what the definition of trafficking is, how it will sometimes appear. You've also been given a model to look at to say, okay, this is how this kind of plays out. But I also want you to think about the environment in which you're living, or look at the news and the things that are happening within our society. And you see now that you have this kind of push pull or push factors that may push someone into the space where they feel like maybe trafficking will give me some monetary gain. So look at the things that are happening in our world today. You have genocides or wars, violence, physical or mental. We have a red alert within this country that is saying that we have young girls who are being coerced into the life of trafficking because they're struggling with depression and anxiety. And they have someone that comes along and says that I'm going to change the story for you, that I'm going to buy you a birthday cake, that you feel special in this environment, and they feel that they have a sense of belonging. You also have a lack of employment. You have a lack of educational opportunities, right? We have now the continuation of people not being able to afford to pay their loans or to finance their education. We have natural and man-made disasters, which can displace someone from not just other countries, but also in other states. We have so many things that are happening with climate change, and this has impacted individuals. We also need to talk about poverty. We have millions of individuals in our country who are living in poverty. And so if someone comes along and says that you can make $1,000 in a week, and that you only have to service their friends for that time being, it sounds like something that people may, consider. When we talk about someone being impacted by trauma, if you have a history of trauma, it's very easy for young individuals to just become accustomed to being part of what is considered a stable and to go in with this group of individuals because they have a sense of belonging or they have a history of trauma. When someone has unstable housing and someone can proposition them to say, you know what, if you do this sex act, then actually I'm going to be able to afford to pay for your housing or to pay for your rent. So when we talk about this idea of trafficking, sometimes people get in their mind, well, if you're strong-willed or if you come from a specific socioeconomic background, that this can be something that you can push through or say no to. But I'm offering you this opportunity to sit with this idea of this push-pull model and the pull factors that can actually impact someone into moving into this area where they can't quite navigate their way out. Now, the pull factors can be very interesting for individuals who are sitting in this place of unemployment. Well, I'm going to offer you a job. I'm going to offer you the opportunity to get a degree. I'm actually going to give you a quality life, especially if you have young girls who have a very low self-esteem, right? And no one has ever told them that they love and care about them. If you are feeling that you're not safe and secure, that yes, I'm here, but someone in my family is abusing me, right? The family is in need for essentials, and the youth feels obligated to step up, right? Or fear of deportation or death. So when we talk about trafficking in the sense, there are a lot of things that we have to consider, and one of them is the push-pull factors. Now, the other thing that I want to bring up, because I think this is also important as well, is there's often these blanket statements that come out and they give us these numbers and they talk about how this is a very, very lucrative business for so many individuals who feel that it is okay to traffic others. I think that it's really begs us to question, how does this even happen to the families and the youth that we are working with? When you talk about 40.3 million people who are trafficked, and 1 in 4 are children, and that because someone feels that it's okay to exploit another person, that the revenue gain is approximately $150 billion. So we're talking about the combination of companies like Starbucks and Walmart or Amazon, right? So if you start to think about the money and follow the money, this also is going to bring us into our conversation over the next couple of days as to what is being done to try to address the money going from different accounts to pay for services and to exploit youth. Now, the realities of human trafficking, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, talks about the age, right? And so, and given my background, we often are involved with youth at a very young age. And so this should automatically send a red flag to you that you need to be mindful of the groups that you are working with. So the average age is 11 to 14 years old. Now, I also want to cue you into the fact that in some countries, it can be even as young as 5 years old. When we talk about human trafficking, especially when it comes to the system of care that we work in New Jersey, this is especially a hot button issue for us because we understand that we are working with youth that are between the ages of 0 to 21. And when we say this 0 to 21 number, we're referring to expecting mothers, and we understand that sometimes if that creates a financial burden, that they may seek to try to have someone who can provide them with the basic needs, right? Now, the other piece that I want to bring to your attention is that human trafficking is not prostitution. And this kind of aligns with the age. When we talk about 11 to 14 years old, often we find that some adults beyond the age of 18 will say that they were trafficked at a very young age. But now that they are beyond the age of 18, they feel that they are being prostituted. But we have to understand that there's a difference between being trafficked because you cannot consent at that young age beyond 18 to be part of a trafficking ring or to be exploited in this way. When we talk about human trafficking, the other piece that comes into play is that whether or not it's statutory rape, and that's also not the case because again, you can't consent. And as you are following in the information that I'm providing, you realize that there's a third party, and that third party is gaining something, whether it's monetary or otherwise, from the exploitation of that child. So in New Jersey, 16 years of age can legally consent to have sex with an adult. But again, that does not include the third party. So once you include the third party, that is when we consider that human trafficking. Now, if we talk about human trafficking by the numbers, and you think about the amount of trauma that comes with being raped, with servicing multiple Johns, um, we have to understand that many of the youth that we are talking about have gone missing. And we want to use the term gone missing because we don't want to try to say that someone has run away or was thrown away because these are children, right? And we realize that when we have this large amount of individuals that have gone missing, that we need to be mindful because we know between 24 to 48 hours, they can be approached by a trafficker. Normally, this would happen where? In a park or a bus station, right? So when we see that someone has gone missing, we need to be mindful that there's someone out there that is looking to lure them into this world of trafficking. Trafficking also accounts for 77% of the human trafficking cases. So that is one of the reasons why you often hear a great deal about sex trafficking as opposed to the other forms of trafficking. The other piece, which is very concerning, is the fact that there's only a small percentage of individuals who have survived these trafficking incidents. And so this is one of the reasons why we have to be very, very ambitious about our efforts to support survivors and to make sure that when we are in contact with someone who could potentially be trafficked, that we can encourage them that there's other alternatives to what is being offered by the trafficker. The other space that I want to take you to is more of the reporting and see where we are in terms of reporting. Often those reported victims are foreign and domestic adults, foreign and domestic minors. Okay, so just because you are an adult does not mean that you cannot be trafficked. Again, the third party, thinking of that third party piece. Cases also include labor trafficking for farm and agricultural work construction sites. If you consider in New Jersey, we are considered the garden state, so we have a great deal of farming here. But think about the construction sites. Also, I want to keep in mind in the summertime, we have a lot of carnivals and a lot of traveling carnivals, domestic servitude, forced prostitution, right? So once you've actually been trafficked, now you're being pushed into or forced into prostitution after the age of 18 again. And then again, thinking about what does this look like for someone if it is a combination of them working throughout the day and then being trafficked at night. So when we talk about immigration, something that often comes up is this idea of immigration and trafficking versus smuggling, right? So we have to be mindful that they are different. Now, I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but I'm saying that they are different. Smuggling really assumes that that person is saying, I want to be smuggled into the country. And often people will agree to that and say, you know, I'm going to pay someone to smuggle me into another country. And that's a violation of national boundaries. And we understand that. What we are finding is that once that person is brought into the country and you have that crime against the border and the transportation based and it requires border crossing, and often that's voluntary. You should see that on the left side of your screen. But on the right side, this is where we start to make that distinct comparison that trafficking is a crime against a person. It is exploited based, so you are exploiting that individual. We also understand that it doesn't require that that person be crossed over into another country, and it is involuntary. Even if that person says, okay, I'm 12 years old and I'm going to consent to this, they cannot consent under the age of 18. Now, we have a couple more minutes that I want to focus in on the force, fraud, or coercion piece. I think sometimes when we talk about trafficking, we get caught up in the terms and the definitions, but I want you to kind of leave today with this understanding of this idea of the three key words. And the three key words, and again, can be unfortunately different for different victims, right? It could be unique to their experience. So it could be physical assault, it could be sexual assault, it could be physical confinement or isolation. There's often, you know, shared stories about how, yes, they never got physical with me, but they were extremely, um, very, very negative and made humiliating remarks, and the verbal abuse was just as bad, right? So I don't want to give you this information and think, well, you know, one is better than the other. It's all a heinous crime, and it's a crime against humanity. The other piece is the fraud piece. So that's where we mentioned, you know, I'm going to not only employ you, and we talked about the fraudulent employment offers, but now the false promising of work, maybe someplace to live. And then that's also coupled with, now that you're working here, I'm actually going to withhold your wages, or I'm not going to let you take a break like I said that I would, or I'm going to withhold food. And so all of these things come into that context of the fraud layer. The other piece is the coercion, right? I've brought you to this space or this city or this state, and now that you're here, I've said I'm going to pay for everything for you to get here. But now I turn around and say, actually, you owe me. And in order to pay that back, these are the type of things that you need to do, right? There's also threats of harm, arrest or deportation. Sometimes they will threaten someone's family. They withhold their legal documents. Sometimes they will take hold of their passport. There's also the psychological manipulation, which we'll go into in our workshop number 2, because that kind of puts into context what Kevin Vale calls the chain around the brain, where we start to understand that when someone is going through multiple years of being involved in the trafficking industry, how this has impacted someone in such a way that they just can't leave. Now, I want you to also kind of shift your conversations, whether it's within your office or wherever space that you're in, and start to think about the fact that this could happen to anyone and anywhere. Okay. We often have this false narrative that it doesn't happen, especially when we talk about labor trafficking, that it doesn't happen here. Right. So here's some more myths and facts. Right. Um, and that goes to say that we only have one form of trafficking, and that is sex trafficking. But we also have to think about the other two, which is labor trafficking and organ trafficking. Now, we talked a lot about sex trafficking briefly. I guess I should say we always need more time, but we're talking about sex trafficking, and that is what often comes up with individuals, is the fact that when we think about human trafficking, we're talking about sex, we're talking about Super Bowl, we're talking about connection to large events, but we also have to think about the other forms of trafficking. Now, just to add on to the sex trafficking piece, pimp controlled, commercial front brothels, so sometimes it may be massage parlors or also escort services. But when we move into labor trafficking, it looks a little bit different, because now you're talking about forced labor on top of the debt bondage that we discussed. When we talk about labor trafficking, I think it's important too that we think about how it can impact someone. When I gave you that example that says, listen, you may have an individual that is working throughout the day, and then they are trafficked in a sex trafficking portion of that ring at night. Often what comes into play, especially when we think about a person who is constantly being told that they have to work, moving from space to space, often being told to change their name. There are several conditions that may come with working in that industry. Chronic back pain, visual and respiratory problems, possible scars from beatings, headaches from multiple hits to the head. Hearing loss can also be something that comes up regularly with a person who's been trafficked, labor trafficked, cardiovascular and respiratory problems, and also having amputations because they want them to continue to work. Now, I want you to think about also construction sites. People will be lured into this idea of doing construction work just for that day. And what does that look like in terms of that work for the day? It could be, let me give you I want you to give me your cell phone. We're going to move from space to space to space. They don't return them to the place that they picked them up. There's no communication with their family, right? So there's this idea that they're laying the foundation of fear as well. Now, we've talked extensively about sex trafficking because I know that most people are very familiar with that one. And we've laid a foundation for what labor trafficking looks like. So this should kind of raise your awareness about how often this can occur, just as much as sex trafficking. The other piece that I want to talk about focuses on organ trafficking. This to me was very interesting in the way that it can present, because it involves multiple people at different levels to transport one organ to another person. And in between there is again that compensation, whether it is monetary or otherwise, for an organ. You have people who are involved with a mortuary business. You have someone who may be part of a hospital staff, or you have someone who may be an EMT. That is not to say that these people are corrupt, but in order to transport organs, we understand that there's a time factor involved and that we have to be mindful that in order to do that, you have to have people in place to transport the organs. At one point, for me, it was very clear that this could happen because many of us may watch television shows and they glamorize this, but even if you look on the news, if you look through social media, you see that people will come and say, you know what, I got documentation that they have serial numbers that was attached to any type of transplants, and that was some suspicious activity. So when we talk about organ trafficking, believe it or not, this can happen. It is extremely underground, many of the trafficking, the forms of trafficking that we're discussing, but it is very lucrative, especially if you think about the amount of people who are on the waiting list for kidneys alone. And if someone has the means to make that happen, they will do that. Now, before we kind of start to transition into other information that's going to set the foundation for our workshop one, I want you to think about what are some of the red flags. Now, I know for me, when I was working in New Jersey, in particular with individuals who were struggling with their mental health, there was a lot of red flags that I felt that I missed. So I want you to sit back and think about whatever profession that you're in particular if you're working in communities, if you're in contact with individuals on a regular basis, if you're working in an ER, if you are a clinician, what does that exchange look like? Who is coming into the office with them on a regular basis? Do they have the same tattoo? Are they able to speak freely? What are some other things that you are noticing? So this is why you're going to see often this referral back to red flags. Now, I say this because I don't want you to sit with the checklist and say, well, I didn't see this one and I didn't see this red flag. I didn't see. It's not to say that the person that comes to you may be just open and honest and say, listen, I think I'm being trafficked. But as we move throughout our workshops, we're going to realize the importance of not only being able to recognize red flags, but to also have a plan when that occurs. Now, as I mentioned, depending on whatever organization that you're working with, and I'm going to even expand that to anyone who comes into contact with someone that you may not know. What are some things that may not look quite right to you and that you might want to come to a space where you can ask questions? So that person's reluctant to speak. When we say exhaustion, we mean exhaustion to the point where they just can't get up, they can't move, they're not able to speak as clearly, right? They feel like they're being dominated or controlled, especially in terms of conversation. If the person next to them is taking over their conversation or answering things for them, what does that look like? Right? So, for example, if you're asking them about their history of immunizations, or when's the last time they've been in a hospital or had a checkup, or if you're asking general questions about their overall well-being and their conversation is constantly being controlled by someone else, then that's a red flag. If they're fearful of being alone or having a conversation with you, absolutely. If someone is talking to you and they're saying that, you know what, I'm working extremely long hours, especially if we're talking about a youth, and we know that there are labor laws that don't allow them to work a certain amount of hours during a certain amount of times during the day, and that they should be allotted a certain amount of time to take breaks. If that person has identified that they have been alienated from their family or friends, and this is something that happens often because they want to isolate that person so they can't think clearly for themselves, right? If they're getting elaborate gifts from older partners, and we could even say that if they're getting elaborate gifts from their partners or anyone else, and maybe you're not allowed to meet that person, what does that look like for you? If that makes it uncomfortable in that scenario or in that exchange, then ask, right? What else do I need to know about this person? Or is it possible for me to meet them? Or how are you obtaining all of these gifts? Sometimes we would even find that there were multiple cell phones in the home, right? So who was paying that bill? That was also considered a gift to that child. Signs of abuse. What are some obvious signs of abuse? Do you see any type of markings, cigarette burns, any type of branding, right? These are also red flags for you to look out for. But by all means, if you feel something in your gut that just doesn't look right, that doesn't feel right in terms of your exchange, I think it's best to err on asking a few more questions as opposed to continuing to let that person move on into that space. The other piece that I want you to be mindful of is sometimes, people are reluctant to say things in this situation. So if you feel like something is happening that you're very uncomfortable, try to move them to a space where you can have a conversation about the red flags that you're noticing. Okay. Now, for clinicians, hospitals, and healthcare professionals, right, you may find that that victim may be concerned about being arrested or imprisoned. So it's important that you do your homework and be mindful of the laws that are often put in place to protect victims of trafficking. They may also have multiple STIs, sexually transmitted infections, right? Occupational, what type of injuries does this person have? And is it directly related to the type of work that they're saying that they do? Evidence that care has been lacking, right? So what about this cut or this scar that you have? And it looks like it's been healing, but it's also been on your arm or leg or face for quite some time. So you need to be mindful about those existing conditions. What we want to do now is we want to thank you for coming into this space and for allowing me to lay the foundation.
So again, I want to thank everyone for attending today. And also, please take a moment to complete a very short evaluation survey. If you enjoyed today's training webinar, we still would like for you to let us know. We're a SAMHSA funded program, and as part of receiving this funding, we are also required to obtain our evaluation information. So it helps us inform us as to what your needs are in your location, and that way we can also provide this information to SAMHSA. We also want to share that we have a podcast titled Flourishing at Work. It's a helping plan for professionals. You may find this in Spotify, Apple Music, and Podbean. And if you missed any of our previous webinars hosted by the Northeastern Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, you may access the webinar recordings as well as the slides by going to our website and going into our products and catalog, and that's where you'll be able to download the slides and recording. As I mentioned in the chat, everyone will receive a certificate of completion within 7 days of today. And also you'll receive a link to the recording only for the recorded portion, not the Q&A. And then a summary handout. We will not be sharing slides for this series, but you will receive a summary handout as well as resources that you may find useful. We invite you to connect with us and follow us on our various social media channels. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Our handles are Northeastern Caribbean MHTTC. And if you're not signed up on our email listserv, we ask you to please do so from our website. So again, I want to thank Dr. Jones. Thank you so much for joining us, for providing us with the wonderful wealth of knowledge on the foundational knowledge of human trafficking. We hope everyone is going to take away a lot of knowledge, maybe conversation starters, and getting the ideas going in their organizations within their capacities, and bringing more awareness to this important topic. Do you have any other comments you'd like to share?
Absolutely. I think this sets us up for a very important conversation in our workshop number 2. I'm hoping that over the next couple of days, you sit with some of this information, come back with questions so that we are all continuing to learn from each other and we can all be armed to continue this fight. And I wish you all a pleasant evening, and I'm looking forward to gathering again in a couple of days. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we hope you have a wonderful day as well.